When you take thousands of adults, strip away their daily routines, place them in a floating biosphere, and introduce a highly emotional national holiday, the normal social guardrails simply evaporate. Have you ever wondered exactly how the human mind bends when subjected to maritime isolation? These documented cases reveal what happens when deeply ingrained traditions are forced onto a ship. 1. At 4:15 in the morning on a 4,000-passenger megaship sailing through the Eastern Caribbean, a 52-year-old passenger named Greg initiated a hostile, bloodless takeover of Deck 11. Using 3 rolls of highly visible bright yellow painter's tape he had specifically packed in his checked luggage for this exact purpose, Greg cordoned off an estimated 144 square feet of prime starboard pool deck real estate, enclosing 6 premium loungers, 2 side tables, and a structural steel pillar entirely within his sovereign borders. His motivation was incredibly specific. It was the 4th of July, and Greg was securing the ultimate unobstructed viewing box for the evening's grand fireworks display. This extreme territoriality is a well-documented byproduct of the cruise environment. When passengers are temporarily stripped of their land-based status symbols like cars, property lines, and fences, human psychology quickly compensates by assigning intense, completely irrational value to whatever scarce resource is available. In this case, proximity to the mahogany railing. For the next 15 consecutive hours, Greg operated like a deeply sunburned Border Patrol agent. He aggressively deployed his striped hotel towels over every inch of the plastic furniture and refused to leave his taped-off zone even to use the restroom, relying instead on his profoundly exhausted and deeply embarrassed brother-in-law, Gary, to ferry him plates of lukewarm buffet hot dogs and glasses of iced tea. Have you ever wondered what exactly goes through a grown man's head when he is intensely guarding a plastic side table from a confused elderly woman just trying to read her electronic tablet in the shade? Greg treated every approaching passenger as a direct, calculated threat to American liberty, sternly tapping his yellow tape with the toe of his sandal and shaking his head with the solemn, unyielding authority of a man guarding the nuclear launch codes. He even drafted a makeshift sign out of a paper plate that read, "Reserved for Patriotism," and taped it to the structural pillar. By 9 p.m., a crowd of about 200 people had naturally gathered directly behind Greg's fortified perimeter, implicitly accepting his authority simply because he seemed so overwhelmingly confident in his ownership of the starboard rail. At 9:15 p.m., Greg stood up, placed his right hand firmly over his heart, and stared out into the pitch-black ocean, waiting for the sky to erupt in a magnificent thundering crescendo of red, white, and blue. At 9:30 p.m., he was still standing there, though slightly shifting his weight. At 9:45 p.m., a passing deck attendant carrying a stack of dirty towels gently tapped Greg on the shoulder to inform him of a rather crucial piece of maritime reality. With the exception of one specific family-focused cruise line, passenger vessels absolutely do not shoot highly explosive incendiary devices off their decks in the middle of the ocean due to incredibly strict international fire safety regulations. Greg had spent 17 grueling hours vigorously defending an empty patch of rubberized flooring, nearly fought 3 different grandfathers, skipped both breakfast and a lobster dinner, and alienated his extended family, all to secure a front row seat to stare at total, absolute darkness. 2. The phenomenon of cabin door decorating on cruise ships usually involves a few tasteful magnets or a customized whiteboard. But for a passenger named Linda on Deck 8, the 4th of July was an excuse to turn her entryway into a psychological weapon. By 10 a.m., Linda had completely obscured her metal cabin door beneath 24 battery-operated flashing strobe lights, a massive foil flag, and her crowning achievement, a plastic, motion-activated bald eagle with a heavily distorted speaker built into its beak. The temporary community of a cruise ship hallway is a fragile ecosystem where forced proximity requires a baseline level of mutual respect, but Linda clearly viewed Deck 8 as her personal parade float. The Eagle was highly sensitive and possessed an incredibly wide sensor radius. Every single time a passenger stepped out of their cabin, walked past to get ice, or simply opened their door to check the time, the plastic bird would violently flap its wings and screech a deafening, metallic 15-second rendition of a patriotic march. By 2 p.m., the 50 passengers residing in the starboard corridor were essentially being held hostage in their rooms, terrified to step into the hallway lest they trigger the screeching bird. People were army-crawling past cabin 8204, hugging the opposite wall and timing their movements to the sway of the ship, trying to avoid the motion sensor. The absurdity reached its peak when a room steward, attempting to deliver fresh towels, accidentally dropped his master key, triggering the eagle 6 consecutive times. The hallway echoed with an endless loop of distorted trumpets until a neighbor from across the hall finally snapped, stepped out in his bathrobe, and calmly placed a wet washcloth directly over the eagle's face, neutralizing the threat and restoring peace to the corridor. 3. The concept of artificial scarcity is never more powerfully demonstrated than when a cruise line releases a limited edition souvenir, a behavioral trigger that can instantly transform rational adults into ruthless maritime smugglers. On the morning of July 4th, a major American cruise line announced in their daily newsletter that the main atrium bar would be serving a specialty holiday cocktail in a custom, light-up plastic cup shaped like a star, heavily flashing red, white, and blue LEDs. The newsletter casually mentioned that there were only 500 cups available for a ship carrying roughly 3,000 passengers. A 55-year-old passenger named Brenda read this sentence at breakfast and immediately interpreted it not as a fun holiday promotion, but as a high-stakes commodities market. Brenda mobilized her group of 4 friends, assigning them specific tactical roles like they were pulling off a casino heist. Their strategy was remarkably organized. 2 friends would stand in the inevitably long line at the atrium bar, purchase the maximum allowed 2 drinks per transaction at $14 each, immediately walk to the nearest restroom to pour the sugary blue liquid down the sink, rinse the flashing cups, and hand them off to Brenda, who was managing a growing stockpile in a canvas tote bag by the elevators. By 1 p.m., the group had spent nearly $400 on drinks they did not consume, successfully hoarding 28 flashing star cups. When people are isolated at sea, the rules of status and value warp entirely. Things that would be completely worthless in a suburban strip mall suddenly become heavily coveted luxury items simply because nobody else can have them. As the day wore on and the bar officially sold out of the cups, Brenda's table in the buffet became a glowing, pulsating beacon of exclusive wealth. She painstakingly arranged the 28 flashing cups into a massive blinking pyramid right next to the carving station, sitting back with her arms crossed, basking in the deeply envious stares of other passengers. The sheer audacity of the glowing pyramid inevitably drew attention, and human nature took its course. A desperate man in a floral shirt approached Brenda and offered her $20 for 1 cup. Brenda, sensing the market had shifted in her favor, narrowed her eyes and demanded $40. The man paid in cash. For the next 3 hours, Brenda essentially operated an illicit, unregulated glowing cup cartel out of the ship's buffet, quietly negotiating prices and slipping cups out of her tote bag in exchange for crisp $20 bills. She sold 12 cups, entirely recouping her initial investment, and smugly went to sleep convinced she was the greatest entrepreneurial mind currently operating in international waters. The twist, however, arrived the very next morning when the ship docked at the cruise line's heavily advertised private island in the Bahamas. Brenda confidently marched off the gangway, carrying 3 of her prized flashing cups hooked to her belt loop to display her elite status. She walked down the pier, rounded the corner toward the main beach, and stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting in the blazing Caribbean sun were 4 massive wooden shipping pallets completely loaded with thousands upon thousands of the exact same flashing star cups. The cruise line was literally handing them out for free with every purchase of a $6 fruit punch at the island's beach bar. Brenda stood there, watching hundreds of indifferent passengers casually tossing the rare cups into the sand, suddenly realizing that her intricately planned, heavily financed, cutthroat maritime smuggling operation had been completely undone by the basic logistical reality of a warehouse inventory restock. 4. Culinary neophobia, the fear of trying new or unfamiliar foods, often disguises itself as intense cultural pride, especially when passengers are placed in the upscale, highly regulated environment of a cruise ship dining room. A passenger named Dave, a man who firmly believed that international cuisine was inherently suspicious, decided that he was not going to trust a French-trained culinary team to provide proper nourishment on the 4th of July. When Dave arrived for his 7 p.m. seating in the main dining room, his tuxedo jacket was bulging oddly at the waist. As the elegant, white-gloved waiter placed a beautifully plated lobster thermidor in front of him, Dave unbuttoned his jacket to reveal a black, heavy-duty tactical nylon belt strapped around his waist. Clipped into the various holsters and pouches were not tools or emergency supplies, but 6 full-sized plastic squeeze bottles of store-bought condiments he had smuggled from home. Without breaking eye contact with the horrified sommelier, Dave unholstered a bottle of neon yellow mustard and applied a heavy, deliberate zigzag pattern directly across his delicate lobster meat. He then reached for a bottle of thick, white ranch dressing and drowned his side of truffled asparagus, tapping the bottom of the bottle to ensure every last drop fell onto the porcelain plate. The restaurant manager, summoned by a waiter who looked as though he were witnessing a crime against humanity, approached the table and delicately asked if there was something wrong with the preparation of the meal. Dave calmly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, holstered his ranch dressing with the smooth precision of an Old West gunslinger, and flatly stated that it just needed a little more freedom. He then proceeded to eat the heavily smothered meal with absolute satisfaction, completely oblivious to the 3 different chefs peeking out from the galley doors, staring in profound, silent despair at what he had just done to their carefully crafted artistry. 5. A fundamental truth of modern maritime engineering is that contemporary megaships are intentionally designed to be slightly disorienting mazes, naturally funneling passengers toward revenue-generating venues by removing straight hallways and clear sightlines. A group of 4 friends in their late 40s, Barbara, Susan, Janet, and Diane, entirely ignored this architectural reality when they decided to execute a self-organized 13 colonies pub crawl to celebrate the 4th of July. The premise was highly ambitious, bordering on a logistical nightmare. They planned to visit 13 different bars across the massive vessel in a single afternoon, consuming one specifically themed beverage at each stop to honor the original states. They had even printed out thick, laminated maps and wore matching custom visors. The core issue, however, was that a vessel carrying roughly 4,000 passengers does not have a simple, linear layout, and navigating it requires a basic, functioning understanding of nautical directions. By 2 p.m., they had successfully conquered the aft pool bar, the smoky casino lounge, and the British pub on Deck 5. But by Colony 4, the sheer size of the ship and the accumulating effects of 3 highly sugary, neon-colored tropical drinks completely dismantled their internal compasses. They spent 45 solid minutes wandering in tight circles around the windowless, heavily carpeted corridors of Deck 4, desperately looking for the jazz lounge, repeatedly walking past the exact same photo gallery display of people posing with an anchor. The psychological effect of routine disruption was in full, undeniable force. Outside of their normal daily environments and separated from cellular GPS, these 4 highly successful, educated professionals completely lost the ability to read a simple, 2-dimensional map. Eventually, Barbara took the lead, pushed confidently through a set of heavy, unmarked wooden double doors, completely convinced they had found the elusive martini bar. Instead, they had stumbled directly into the middle of a highly serious, incredibly quiet fine art auction. About 60 passengers were sitting in neat rows of velvet chairs, silently holding up numbered plastic paddles, while a tuxedo-clad auctioneer spoke in hushed, reverent tones about a Peter Max lithograph. Rather than realizing their mistake, processing the silence, and backing out gracefully, Barbara simply assumed this was a highly exclusive, interactive lounge concept. She proudly marched down the center aisle, held up her laminated map, and loudly asked the man at the podium if they served frozen margaritas in Pennsylvania. The auctioneer, an elegant man who had clearly dealt with lost passengers before, didn't even lower his microphone. He simply offered a tight, professional smile and gently informed Barbara that while he was currently taking bids on a watercolor landscape, the frozen margaritas were located precisely 2 decks above them. Suddenly realizing that 60 silent art collectors were staring blankly at their matching visors, the 4 women slowly lowered their map and awkwardly tiptoed backward out of the double doors, bringing their colonial expansion to a remarkably quiet halt at state number 4. 6. The hyperfixation on getting what you paid for is a well-documented facet of behavioral economics. But the cruise environment often warps this instinct into completely abstract, purely theoretical territories. At exactly 9 a.m. on the 4th of July, a passenger named Richard approached the guest services desk holding a small spiral notebook and a solar-powered calculator. The ship had sailed east the previous night, which meant the captain had instructed everyone via the public address system to set their clocks forward 1 hour at 2 a.m. to seamlessly match the new time zone. Richard had done the math, and he was completely unsatisfied with the result. He calmly explained to the guest services representative that because the clock had skipped entirely from 2 to 3 in the morning, his 4th of July was technically only 23 hours long. He was not complaining about the sunlight, the buffet schedule, or the entertainment options. He was entirely focused on the rigid principle of the matter. Richard argued, with absolute, unwavering sincerity, that the cruise line had mathematically deprived him of roughly 4.16% of his national holiday. He laid his calculator flat on the marble counter, pointing a pen at the exact fraction on the digital screen, and formally requested a prorated refund for the 60 minutes of stolen freedom. The representative, a young woman from Romania, who had previously fielded inquiries about everything from the temperature of the ocean to the specific shape of the ice cubes, didn't even blink or attempt to argue international time standards. She simply opened a drawer, retrieved a standard voucher for a complimentary specialty coffee, and slid it smoothly across the counter. Richard looked at the small piece of paper, looked down at his calculator, nodded with the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully negotiated a complex international treaty, and walked away completely victorious. 7. The main pool on a cruise ship is generally a neutral zone of shared relaxation, a crowded aquatic plaza where passengers from all over the world quietly float together holding frozen drinks. But human behavior is strongly influenced by vacation tribalism, a phenomenon where individuals and temporary communities form intense, spontaneous allegiances based on completely arbitrary characteristics, like matching towel colors, or, in this case, a passport. A highly enthusiastic solo traveler named Marcus, a man in his late 30s wearing mirrored aviator sunglasses and a profoundly tight red, white, and blue swimsuit, decided that the pool needed an organized, highly competitive sporting event to properly observe the holiday. At precisely 1 p.m., Marcus waded into the 4-foot deep water holding a standard, slightly underinflated beach ball and loudly announced the formation of a water volleyball match. The United States versus the rest of the world. He quickly recruited 3 very confused guys from Ohio who had just been standing by the stairs discussing golf handicaps. The opposing team was even less prepared for this sudden athletic draft. It consisted of Matteo, a profoundly relaxed Italian tourist who was simply trying to cool his shoulders, and a couple from New Zealand who were holding completely full, highly elaborate piña coladas. Marcus treated this casual, completely uninvited encounter like a high-stakes international athletic final broadcast to millions. Before serving the ball, he gathered the 3 Ohio guys in a tight, serious huddle, drawing up complex defensive plays using rapid hand signals that made absolutely no sense in waist-deep water. When the game actually began, the New Zealanders barely moved, gently batting the plastic ball over the invisible net with their free hands while taking slow sips from their paper straws. Marcus, however, was an absolute blur of frantic motion. He was diving sideways into the water, shouting out court positions, and attempting aggressive windmill spikes that simply resulted in massive, uncoordinated splashes, frequently hitting his own completely baffled teammates in the back of the head. The score quickly reached 14-0 in favor of the international team, purely because Marcus's highly complex, completely unnecessary strategies kept resulting in the beach ball floating gently out of bounds. Every time Matteo scored a point by simply standing completely still and letting the ball bounce harmlessly off his chest, Marcus would call a tactical timeout, wiping chlorinated water from his eyes and fiercely demanding more hustle from the Ohio guys, who were now actively trying to sneak away toward the buffet stairs. Finally, at an astonishing 20-0, the maritime environment itself intervened. The ship made a slight navigational turn to adjust to the wind, causing the water in the pool to shift heavily from port to starboard. Marcus threw the ball over the imaginary net, and the sudden manufactured wave gently pushed Matteo 2 feet to the left, allowing the ball to land squarely in the water. Marcus had scored a single, solitary point. He erupted. He threw both hands into the air, splashed the water victoriously, pointed at the sky, and shouted a triumphant phrase about never giving up in the face of adversity. The game was over, the score was 20-1, but Marcus waded out of the pool with the sheer, unbridled confidence of a heavily decorated Olympic champion. He sat heavily on a lounger, breathing hard, wrapping himself tightly in a striped towel and staring proudly at the water, lost in a beautiful moment of complete, total delusion. But the true comedic twist, the moment that completely dismantled his manufactured glory, arrived exactly 5 minutes later. As Marcus sat there recovering from his monumental athletic exertion, the ship's actual cruise director walked onto the pool deck holding a microphone and accompanied by 2 crew members carrying a professional-grade, highly visible volleyball net. The director cheerfully announced over the public address system that the official, scheduled Independence Day volleyball tournament was about to begin, and called for all interested passengers to sign up at the towel station. Marcus froze, his towel halfway to his face. He hadn't been playing in a tournament. He had just spent 45 minutes intensely harassing 4 completely random, entirely uninterested tourists who were just trying to exist quietly in the water. He watched in absolute silence as 20 athletic, prepared passengers eagerly lined up for the real game. Utterly exhausted and completely out of energy, Marcus slowly sank down into his lounger, pulled his mirrored sunglasses firmly down over his eyes, and quietly pretended to be deeply asleep for the next 2 solid hours. 8. The gamification of personal fitness is a powerful motivator, but when combined with the utter isolation of a cruise ship and holiday excitement, it often results in highly specific, completely unnecessary physical ordeals. A 35-year-old passenger named Todd decided that the only proper way to celebrate the 4th of July was to run exactly 17.76 kilometers on the fitness center treadmills. While the distance itself is a perfectly respectable athletic goal, Todd felt the occasion required highly specialized attire. He arrived at the gym at 7 a.m. wearing standard, modern running shorts, a tight moisture-wicking shirt, and a heavy, historically accurate, full-sized felt colonial tri-corner hat. The gym was mostly empty, but Todd selected the treadmill directly in the center of the room, maximizing his visibility. Running on a moving ship requires significant, constant balance, as the floor gently pitches and rolls beneath the belt. Running on a moving ship while wearing a large, rigid, triangular hat with 0 aerodynamic properties requires the intense, unwavering concentration of a professional tightrope walker. Because the rigid brim of the hat kept catching the breeze from the gym's ceiling vents and threatening to fly off, Todd flatly refused to turn on the personal cooling fan attached to his machine. Within 3 kilometers, he was sweating so profusely that his shirt changed color entirely, but he stubbornly kept his head perfectly level, gripping the side rails whenever the ship hit a swell, fiercely protecting the structural integrity of his historical headwear. A maintenance worker replacing rolled towels in the corner stood completely transfixed, watching a grown man in a soaking wet colonial hat slowly jog toward the flat horizon, absolutely determined to conquer the metric system in the name of liberty. 9. The psychology of queuing in a cruise ship atrium is a fragile social construct, one that can be easily manipulated by anyone possessing a firm voice and unwarranted confidence. At 4 p.m. on the 4th of July, a disorganized crowd of roughly 80 passengers gathered near the grand staircase, eagerly waiting for a heavily advertised, complimentary champagne toast. A 60-year-old passenger named Gary, an amateur historian with a deep appreciation for bureaucracy, looked at the chaotic mass of thirsty vacationers and decided this was a structural failure that required immediate intervention. Gary stepped to the front of the crowd holding a plastic bingo clipboard and firmly announced that, in honor of the holiday, the line must be strictly reorganized based on the historical order in which each passenger's home state ratified the Constitution. The fascinating behavioral reality here is that when people are placed in a transient, unfamiliar environment, they will almost always obey absurd instructions simply to avoid social friction. Rather than questioning Gary's authority or asking if he actually worked for the cruise line, the crowd completely complied. If you ever want to test the absolute limits of human obedience, just hold a plastic clipboard and speak with unearned certainty. For 20 solid minutes, Gary walked up and down the carpeted stairs, conducting brief geographical interrogations. He politely but firmly relocated a profoundly confused couple from Nevada to the very back of the queue, enthusiastically promoted a mildly annoyed man from Delaware to the absolute front, and forced 3 women from Ohio into a tense, hushed debate about the exact year of their statehood. Gary managed this complex logistical puzzle with the unwavering sternness of a highly decorated traffic controller. By the time the beverage staff finally arrived pushing 2 rolling carts loaded with sparkling wine, Gary had successfully organized 80 completely random adults into a perfect, historically accurate timeline of American territorial expansion. The cruise director, completely bewildered by the deeply silent, mathematically spaced single-file line, happily began handing out the flutes of complimentary drinks. Gary, feeling an immense wave of patriotic pride, stepped forward to claim his reward. However, because Gary was a lifelong resident of Hawaii, the 50th state admitted to the Union, he had honorably placed himself at the absolute geographic end of his own meticulously crafted line. He stood there in profound silence as the waiter handed the very last glass of champagne to an Alaskan tourist, leaving the great logistical mastermind of the queue with absolutely nothing but an empty bingo clipboard and a deeply unquenched thirst. 10. The culinary arts team on a cruise ship takes immense professional pride in their holiday displays, frequently carving massive, elaborate centerpieces out of solid blocks of ice. At the entrance to the Lido buffet, they had installed a spectacular 4-foot-tall ice sculpture of a bald eagle mid-flight. However, human beings possess a deeply ingrained instinct to intervene when they perceive a structural failure, even when their help is completely unwarranted and fundamentally useless. A passenger named Arthur, wearing a floral shirt and holding a plate of hash browns, stopped to admire the eagle and noticed a single tiny drop of water fall from its frozen beak. Convinced that the majestic bird was rapidly melting in the ambient humidity of the breakfast buffet, Arthur decided to launch a unilateral, highly urgent rescue operation. He bypassed the omelet station, grabbed a pair of metal serving tongs from the sliced melon display, and began frantically transferring square ice cubes from the beverage dispensers, painstakingly building a protective, frozen retaining wall around the base of the sculpture. He worked with the focused intensity of a civil engineer reinforcing a failing dam. When he ran out of accessible ice, he started packing the eagle's lower talons with cold, wet linen napkins. A sous chef finally stepped out of the kitchen doors, stared in profound confusion at the man attempting to insulate a frozen statue with damp cloth, and gently explained that the sculpture was resting in a specialized, refrigerated metal drip tray designed to keep it solid for exactly 14 hours. Arthur simply nodded, entirely unbothered by the scientific facts, firmly believing he had just successfully preserved a national monument through sheer ingenuity. 11. Cruise line loyalty programs create a powerful, highly visible pseudo-class system among passengers, transforming otherwise rational adults into fiercely territorial aristocrats deeply obsessed with their tier status. The ship's main theater was hosting the annual passenger talent show on the 4th of July. But a 70-year-old passenger named Eugene, a man who had reached the absolute highest achievable tier in the cruise line's loyalty program, a status that grants a different colored plastic room key, and an inflated sense of maritime authority, viewed the stage not as an entertainment venue, but as a crucial historical platform. Eugene had signed up for a 5-minute slot, listing his act simply as a dramatic historical reading. When his name was announced, he walked onto the stage wearing dark slacks, a crisp white shirt, and a remarkably serious expression. He approached the microphone, adjusted it with deliberate precision, and unrolled a thick parchment scroll he had printed in the ship's internet cafe, sealed with red wax scavenged from the buffet's cheese station. Eugene then began to loudly project a deeply personal document he had titled the Declaration of Maritime Grievances. He flawlessly adopted the exact cadence and sweeping theatrical tone of the original Declaration of Independence, but replaced the historical complaints against the British Crown with a meticulous list of minor inconveniences regarding the cruise line's recent policy updates. When in the course of nautical events, Eugene boomed, his voice echoing through the massive auditorium, it becomes necessary for loyal passengers to dissolve the corporate bands which have connected them to a previously generous loyalty program. The audience, which consisted of roughly 800 people holding untouched tropical drinks, initially sat in stunned silence, trying to process whether this was an intellectual comedy routine. Eugene continued unabated, detailing his profound sorrow over the reduction in complimentary laundry services and the sudden removal of the free nightly chocolate squares from his cabin pillow. "They have erected a multitude of new drink package limits," he proclaimed, pointing an accusing finger toward the lighting booth, "and sent hither swarms of junior officers to strictly enforce them." The psychological phenomenon of shared group validation suddenly took hold. Instead of booing him off the stage, the other high-tier loyalty members in the front rows began to passionately agree. They started nodding, whispering to their spouses and shouting, "Here, here," in genuine support. Eugene was effectively inciting a fiercely polite uprising over dairy products and fabric softener. The atmosphere shifted from mild confusion to organized outrage. Fellow premium guests were actually standing up, clapping loudly after every grievance. Seeing the situation rapidly spiraling out of control, the technical crew quietly cut the power to Eugene's microphone. This was a critical miscalculation. Eugene, fully prepared for corporate censorship, simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a battery-powered plastic megaphone, and continued reading grievance number 12. The crowd went completely wild, chanting for free laundry. The cruise director, realizing the talent show was rapidly devolving into an organized consumer revolt, rushed onto the stage. He needed to defuse the situation instantly, and he knew exactly what psychological button to press. Smiling broadly, the director walked right up to Eugene and cheerfully announced through a working microphone that, as a special reward for his spectacular passion, the ship was presenting him with an exclusive, limited-edition synthetic canvas tote bag and a commemorative plastic lapel pin, not available in any onboard store. The tension in the room hung by a microscopic thread. Eugene, the great revolutionary leader who had just inspired hundreds of retirees to demand corporate reform, slowly lowered his megaphone. He looked at the highly agitated crowd, then looked at the incredibly cheap, mass-produced plastic pin. The psychology of artificial scarcity is completely undefeated. Without a single moment of hesitation, Eugene smiled warmly, let the director pin the cheap plastic to his lapel, grabbed the synthetic tote bag, and cheerfully asked if they had it in navy blue. He then waved proudly to the crowd and walked off the stage. The revolution instantly evaporated, permanently derailed by the irresistible allure of free promotional merchandise. These cases prove that vacation mode doesn't relax people. It just redirects their stress into completely useless maritime goals. Which was worse, the 17-hour table guard or the historically accurate champagne queue? Drop your vote in the comments. Hit subscribe to keep exploring the bizarre psychology of cruise travel, because human nature is always strangest at sea.